So here you were, you had the pre-flight, say at 4 in the afternoon, to tell you where he's going. He's going after these bridges, and so you had about 6 or 7 hours to sit there in the plane knowing what he's headed for.
Yeah, right.
You knew what was going to happen to you. And so you could say, God, I hope this isn't our night tonight. And that's when I got wounded as they hit. That shell exploded right next to my left window. They kept telling me those windows were bulletproof, but it hit so close that it just shredded the rudder on the plane and knocked 2 big holes in the window, left window, and it hit the other side of my compartment and then bounced back into me. And that's when I got wounded. But that was quite an experience there.
Wow.
That's where your flashbacks come from.
Yeah. What was that, your last mission, or what mission?
No, that was the 31st mission.
31st? Oh, jeez.
11 more missions after that. At the time, you try not to think about that. Here again, you're just doing your job, you're doing what you've been trained to do. But you soon, or I did anyway, you become a fatalist to start with. When you first go into combat, you start wondering, now is there a bullet out there that's got my name on it? And then you start worrying about that. And then the more you're in combat, the more you realize, the more you get shot at, the more you realize there damn sure is a bullet out there that's got your name on it. So
January at Kadena Air Base is balmy. The average temperature is just right at about 72. In Pyongyang in January, it's snowy, below freezing all the time, often below zero. Major David McGee of the 307th Bombardment Group was in Pyongyang in January 1952. McGee was radar operator on the 371st Squadron B-29, shot down by a MiG-15 on November 10, 1950. The crew bailed out and was captured by the moment they hit the ground. He was one of 23 airmen of the 307th listed as alive in the Communists' December 1951 announcement. Since capture, he had been force-marched across frozen ground, interrogated with a pistol to his head, tortured, strung up by his wrists from the ceiling of dark, dank holding places, and tossed into solitary confinement in tiny holes in the ground. Along the way, he gave his captors fits with 100-page confessions they discovered to be fanciful fabrications, sometimes including coded messages that he hoped would somehow get through to American intelligence and to his family. By the summer of 1952, the Communists began treating their American prisoners more decently, as truce talks began to show some promise of progress. McGee would survive to be repatriated in September 1953. The pilot of that B-29 was First Lieutenant Billy Fauché. From Camp No. 5 in Pyeongtaek along the Yellow River in far North Korea, Pulitzer Prize-winning Associated Press photographer Frank Noel dispatched a photograph of U.S. POWs sorting an abundance of prisoner mail. Noel had also been captured in November 50 with the Marines at Chosin Reservoir. Lieutenant Fauché is on the left. Next to him are Marine Corps 83 pilot Hayward Cameron, B-29 pilot Captain William McTaggart of the 98th Bomb Wing, and Marine Corps F-4 pilot Captain Gerald Fink. It looks to me as if these smiling POWs were well-fed, warm, and free to talk among themselves. Noel and 3 of these pilots were returned to military custody in September 1953 in Operation Big Switch. But Captain Cameron is still missing in action. But it was too late for radio operator Staff Sergeant Jimmy Sanders. He was on the same crew as Major McGee and Lieutenant Fauché. He lost his toes to frostbite during the long winter marches en route to Pyeongtaek Prison Camp No. 5. Though fed only a few grains of indigestible, uncooked whole kernel corn, he survived the bitter sub-zero winter temperatures. And in May, Radio Peking broadcast a message to his family that they had coerced from Sanders. He refused to sign the June 1951 peace appeal to gain relief from his maltreatment. His captors broke all his ribs. Staff Sergeant Sanders died that summer of 1951 of pellagra. That's a horrible malady brought on by malnutrition, producing large sores that fill with pus, turns the skin dark red, and eventually drives its victim into an apathetic state of despondency, leading to death due to starvation and infection. And the communists were unspeakably cruel to Sanders' wife, 3 children, father, mother, and 10 brothers and sisters when they published his name in the July 1951 China Monthly as among the living, when in fact he had perished as a result of their war crimes. Many historians treat 1952 as a period of routine, radar-directed bombing missions that night after night went after rail lines, airfields, and close support of ground troops. But for the 307th, the war was anything but routine. Transportation delays in crew rotations had kept airmen in the combat zone months longer than their 6-month tour of temporary duty. By January 1952, the delays had been temporarily overcome, but the lingering effect was that the 307th started the year with 60% new crews. Few were as experienced as the earlier cohorts of airmen, and most were hastily trained before reporting for combat duty in Korea. The aircraft in-commission rate dropped from the customary 80% level in 1950-51 to 42% at the beginning of January 1952. That month, the wing flew 10 combat missions and had only 1 encounter with enemy MiGs, although it suffered no damage from enemy aircraft or flak. This photo shows an apparently less experienced radio operator, PFC John F. Roth on the left, in the radio area of his B-29 before takeoff for a January 1952 strike, discussing the upcoming mission with a more experienced RO, Staff Sergeant Francis R. Teven, who would be Roth's reviewer. Note the throat mics, standard crew comm gear of the day, and back-mounted parachutes. Both airmen were from Brooklyn, New York. The 10 January missions set the combat pace for the first half of 1952, but the 307th lost 3 aircraft in January as a result of inexperienced flight or maintenance crews. The intense operational tempo of 1951 had also taken its toll on the Soviets. The communist commanders returned many MiG-15 pilots to the USSR due to excessive emotional and physical burdens. The High Command decided to have the combat units turn their jets over to replacement units who were to take up the mission of stopping the American B-29s. Their squadron commander, Korean War AA Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Samoylov, reported, "Commands began to accuse the pilots of slacking off. Our physical and psychological fatigue was telling on our performance. Our ranks were thinning and pilots were being held back from missions due to illnesses as well." B-29 encounters with MiGs from January to May 1952 were few, far between, and they rarely involved engagements. Here, 2 307th crewmen follow their pre-flight checklist in preparation for their bombing mission in January 1952. Corporal Charles Sandridge, left gunner, and Tech Sergeant Edwin K. Plant, the all-important flight engineer, both have 19 combat missions in their logbook, yet take nothing for granted in going through the detailed pre-flight procedure. Note that while nose art and names for 307th aircraft were not allowed by SAC rules, the tug used for maneuvering the aircraft on the ground is stenciled with its ground crew assigned nickname, Katie. The 307th experienced another training mission accident on the 1st of February, when 2 inexperienced aircrew jockeying for lead produced a mid-air collision. 1 B-29 suffered a damaged wing and disappeared into the undercast below. All crew were killed. The other aircraft returned to base. Wing Commander Colonel Jennison wrote an official letter to BOMCOM Commander Brigadier General Joe Kelly, asserting that he had insufficient personnel. Those he had were not qualified, and the root cause of recent accidents was pilot error, with lack of maintenance personnel a contributing factor. He followed that letter with another one to Kelly, providing a summary of the actions he was taking to resolve the 307's difficulties, but again complained of lack of parts, inadequate maintenance support from higher echelons, and even the aging of the B-29. Colonel Jennison insisted his chain of command take strong action to pay more attention to detail in supervising pilots to deal with the pilot error challenge. Here, Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Bobby Boyd listens as pilot Captain Edmund T. Arvin runs through mission details for this early 1952 mission. There was another factor contributing to the 307th's discipline challenge. The Air Force as a whole was afflicted in the first half of 1952 with the spread of combat-qualified crewmen claiming they had a psychological fear of flying that prevented them from doing their duty. While the virus was not of pandemic proportions, it was particularly prevalent in the Air Training Command and had drawn the attention of congressional committees. Air Force policy provided for truly affected airmen to be taken off flying status, but it seems many aviators, especially those involuntarily recalled for duty in the Korean War, made the claim as a way to avoid combat duty. Some even had their wives provide supporting testimony to review boards, a tactic that generated General LeMay's view that Air Force policies were too lenient in such cases. Most should be handled by courts-martial, in his opinion. In fact, across the Air Force, there were 14 pending courts-martial dealing with such refusal to fly, all but one of which were resolved by the end of April, with those airmen being returned to combat duty. The 307th was not immune.
We had 8 of us to a tent. All the navigators stayed in the same tent, pilots in the same tent, and we had a pretty big tent filled with pilots that refused to fly. That was a shame.
Colonel Jennison reported to BOMCOM that he did not intend to go along with the prevailing leniency, and if such officers arrived in his command, they would not be allowed to avoid combat duty. In early May, Colonel Jennison was moved out of command of the 307th after 3 months and replaced by Colonel Raymond Wynn. The 307th marked its 14,000th sortie with this photo of the crew that would drop the bomb to mark the occasion. Navigator George Brett, second from left, points to the route in the navigation chart, while the other flight deck crew look on. Bombardier First Lieutenant James R. Miller holding the chart book open, Aircraft Commander William C. Campbell on the left, and Flight Engineer Airman Powell S. Hamner. This crew had completed 5 missions prior to this one. The 307th continued to execute 10 to 12 missions each month from January through May 1952. Almost every target was a railroad choke point of some type: bridges, bypasses, junctions. Air crews quickly gained proficiency in shore-end bombing techniques, and the wing as a whole scored direct hits on at least half of its targets. But the North Koreans repaired and rebuilt their rail lines faster than BOMCOM's B-29 could hit them. The interdiction campaign was designed initially to choke off supplies to communist troops and strangle them into an armistice agreement. But between August 1951 and March 1952, FEAF lost 236 aircraft, while it received only 131 replacement aircraft of the types employed in the interdiction campaign. Anyone could do the math. At these comparative attrition rates, the U.S. would run out of bombers before the Chinese ran out of the supplies, and the enemy would not budge from its positions on conditions for a truce. So, Far Eastern Air Forces Commander General Otto P. Wayland tasked the Operations Division to conduct a staff study to develop a course of action for the future of the air war in Korea. The task fell to Colonel R.L. Randolph and Lieutenant Colonel B.I. Mayo. They delivered the result of their study on the 12th of April. After extensive operations analysis, Randolph and Mayo recommended a fundamental change in the objective of the air war, from disruption of logistics to destruction of materiel and killing troops. A new target list should concentrate effort on locomotives, vehicles, supplies, buildings, rear area troops, manpower, rolling stock, fixed equipment such as radar and guns, rails and rail beds, and frontline troops. And they proposed expanding the target list to include the hydroelectric grid, along and south of the Yalu River, which provided power not only to North Korea, but also to much of northeast China and far eastern Soviet Union. Such a target complex had a few key nodes that would produce a cascading effect on the war effort. FEAF believed destroying and disrupting the power grid would persuade Peking and Moscow to move off their intransigence at Panmunjom and come to an armistice agreement. The staff study concluded with a message that I doubt any Air Force general officer wanted to hear. Quote, despite the increased pressure upon the enemy, which will accrue from the recommended program, air action with available forces and within present restrictions cannot be decisive in Korea, end quote. Based on intelligence collection and analysis of a potential new target list, General Wayland ordered development of a new attack plan and directive that would aim to achieve destruction of a number of new operational targets, manufacturing facilities, mining and ore processing sites, communication centers and military supply facilities that had been moved into towns and villages. The operational tempo for each wing would step up to at least 15 missions per month, with several maximum effort strikes involving 25 or more B-29s of each wing. The 307th's new commanding officer, Colonel Raymond Wynn, was a seasoned World War II veteran of bomber training and combat units. He was Chief of Staff of SAC's 2nd Air Force at Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, when he was sent in May 1952 to take command of the 307th. Wynn's leadership and the new air campaign plan generated a noticeable turnaround in discipline and operational effectiveness of the now experienced 307th Bombardment Wing. As SAC transitioned stateside bomb wings to the jet-powered B-47, more B-29s became available to transfer to Korea for combat operations, and the July in-commission rate climbed back up to 79%. BOMCOM developed new tactics, techniques, and procedures to execute the new attack concept. BOMCOM Commander Brigadier General Wiley Gainey leveraged his close personal relationship with SAC Commander General Curtis LeMay to move more shore-ran capability from the U.S. to Korea and increase the number of shore-ran ground stations in theater from 2 to 6. This enabled executing B-29 strikes from multiple directions simultaneously, rather than having to concentrate the bomber stream along a single arc from IP to target. For a short time, the use of inaccurate aerial maps left over from the Japanese occupation injected some bombing error, but within a few weeks, Air Force intelligence resolved this issue by increasing the number of analysts assigned to using photo imagery for stereo plotting techniques. They could now produce multiplexed navigation charts with accurate target locations within 24 hours of each daily BOMCOM ops order. Using multiple simultaneous approaches to target, BOMCOM could now employ smaller attack groups for each mission. A wing could now be assigned several targets to attack by 3 or 4 B-29s, each using multiple simultaneous approaches. This tactic alone made the Communists' MiG interception and anti-aircraft tasks more challenging by an order of magnitude. Chaff became available for use by B-29s to confuse enemy radar. It works by creating a radio frequency echo that looks like that of the aircraft itself. It came in cartons of bundles and could be dumped out the bomb bay in a random pattern or in a single burst. Dispensed at an appropriate interval, it would make it look to the enemy like there was a continuous stream of B-29s in the air, hiding the actual location of the B-29s in plain sight. A September 1952 staff study revealed that the optimum dispersal pattern would be a continuous rather than random or burst. Missions would then have the lead aircraft dispense chaff to block the enemy radar from distinguishing individual B-29s in a bomber stream. BOMCOM experiments with new electronic gear provided by Air Research and Development Command gave some B-29s another combat multiplier in the form of electronic countermeasures, or ECM. These transmitters could jam enemy searchlights and gun-lying radars. Among several experimental devices, all of which were adaptations of World War II equipment, the ARQ-8 was the most effective against the radars in North Korea. It was initially in short supply, and the 307th had the least number available, only 7 for its September 13th mission to the Suiho hydroelectric plant. But as they became more available, a 13th crew member was added to the B-29 for the ECM operator. Ingenious airmen could take over the enemy's frequencies and make them move the searchlight beam in real time. It could make for an entertaining light show when the threat was not so immediate. The 307th succeeded beyond all expectations in its first mission employing the new TTP. On the 2nd and 3rd of July, they obliterated the railroad bridge at the key choke point of Huichan. Then on the 11th and 12th of July, BOMCOM executed a max effort strike on Pyongyang in Operation Pressure Pump. This strike involved a total of 1,254 sorties on 30 targets, including 54 B-29s, dropping bombs and psychological warfare leaflets on 8 targets in and around the North Korean capital city. The 307th completely destroyed its assigned supply center and elicited letters of commendation from Generals Weyand and Gainey. As a bonus, the destruction killed 400 to 500 senior officers when one bomb scored a direct hit on a North Korean military air raid shelter. These 3 crewmen provide details of their sortie on a headquarters building. Intelligence Officer Captain Dean F. Myers on the left runs down the mission report with Bombardier First Lieutenant Darrell D. Carpenter, Aircraft Commander Captain Cyril J. Hoskinson, and Pilot First Lieutenant Robert C. Ellenson. The mission was not without risk. Aircraft number 062 suffered flak damage over Pyongyang and had to make a belly-up landing on return to Kadena. The crew walked away, and the aircraft was in repairable condition. Radio operator Emmet Pierce described the event in his own words.
Probably the most memorable one is when we took flak and we had to land with the gear up, and because one of the main landing gears wouldn't come down, so we brought it in on its belly. They foamed the runway down, and then we landed, and it was pretty uneventful after that, except for the foam that they squirted on us when we got out of the airplane.
For its 21-22 July mission, BOMCOM assigned the 307th to continue the attacks on North Korea's power grid with a strike on the Chosin hydroelectric plant number 2. No enemy flak or aircraft engaged the 22 B-29s that struck this target, but aircraft number 44-62166 caught fire and crashed on the South Korean east coast between K3 Pohang and K18 Koryo Kangnam. All 13 crew were killed. Post-mission bomb damage assessment photo reconnaissance showed that the 307th scored 7 direct hits on the powerhouse itself, 6 more on the transformer yard, and 4 on the adjacent penstocks. The facility was gutted, and for the second time in a month, Generals Weyand and Gainey issued a letter of commendation to the airmen of the 307th Bombardment Wing. Quote, "The target was rendered a crushing blow," end quote. 307th gunners were not to be denied their marksmanship. They claimed MiG kills on 25 and 31 July. The 31 July mission was another 307th mission of excellence when it destroyed the Oriental Light Metals plant just south of the Yalu River. This time, 87 MiGs were sighted within vicinity of the target, and mission reports indicated the enemy made 33 ineffectual firing passes. The 307th's combat effectiveness reached a new height with an August in-commission rate of 82% and a shore-end bombing effectiveness rate of 97.5%. These 3 crewmen listen as their aircraft commander provides his account of their July 1952 mission. Left to right are Staff Sergeant Gordon B. Stevens, Jr., Flight Engineer, Airman 2nd Class Earl T. Brittingham, Right Gunner, and First Lieutenant John W. Price, radar observer. This trio of 307th gunners slumped wearily in the interrogation room after the 31 July strike on the Oriental Light Metals plant. Left to right, they are Airman First Class Edwin A. Lothian, Airman First Class James A. Hearn, and Airman First Class Thomas D. Noonan. It was one of these three credited initially with the kill of a MiG-15 night fighter in that mission. Intelligence analysis showed that the first month of the destruction campaign had a telling effect. Intercepted reports from the North Korean People's Army General Headquarters indicated that the B-29 strikes had already caused 3 to 5 times more loss of life to the enemy than in the previous 2 years. Until the last July mission, MiGs were largely absent from air battles. That was about to change. By September 1952, the Soviets deployed more advanced radar systems into their now tightly integrated air defense zone along the Yalu River. Early warning radar coverage reached well south of the 38th parallel. 25 ground stations were newly equipped with the San-4 gun control radar. The Soviets' San-4 design was based on a U.S. system whose plans were provided to the USSR during World War II. Here, it extended their tracking reach out to 60 kilometers. The 25 radars were integrated with 11 new ground control intercept stations. The Soviets deployed their more modern Periscope 20 GCI system on 8 trucks and trailers. Periscope could detect B-29s out to 250 kilometers, and it allowed controllers to guide MiG-15s to a B-29 tail to within 600 to 800 meters, with an altitude error of only 80 to 100 meters. The Communists now had a far more tightly knit defensive umbrella for MiG Alley. The improved Soviet air defenses would take their toll on the 307th in September 1952, when the wing was scheduled to send 22 bombers to strike the Suiho hydroelectric plant. 4 B-29s were dedicated to disrupting the enemy's air defenses with electronic countermeasures. But the 16 striking bombers encountered heavy, intense, and accurate flak. Every B-29 was illuminated with searchlights. 3 MiG-15s came up to engage once the anti-aircraft artillery lifted. One World War II veteran reported that the flak was of the box barrage type and was as good as I ever saw the Germans put up. The raid succeeded in shutting down power over most of North Korea and northeast China for weeks, but aircraft 44-86343 failed to return to base after the mission. Post-mission analysis revealed that the enemy employed a new AAA tactic. This was not the first attack on the Suiho complex, and Soviet analysts were able to infer the likely path of the bomber target run for this strike. Even though the 307's EW and Chaff knocked out their fire control radar, the expert Soviet anti-aircraft controllers, gunners, and searchlight operators were able to concentrate their anti-aircraft fire in barrage bursts just ahead of the hydroelectric complex while the B-29s were on their bomb run. In the midst of such a conflagration, a Soviet MiG brought down 343, which exploded in midair over Suiho. The Soviet account of the engagement provides the details. Senior Lieutenant Yuri Dobrivichan was on patrol that night alongside his squadron commander, Captain A.S. Trishkin. The squadron had been training and developing night fighter techniques, and this would be their first night fighter combat engagement. They scrambled for the intercept about 20 minutes prior to the B-29's estimated arrival at Suiho. At 00:11, Dobrivichan caught sight of a B-29 in the glare of the searchlights. He turned, descended, and closed to within 1,000 meters and opened fire. He could not observe any impact at that range, so he opened fire again at less than 300 meters, and this time the tracer scored a direct hit, and an engine on the left wing caught fire. He banked and turned to take a second pass, but flames had already engulfed the bomber, and it began to break up in midair. The aircraft crashed into pieces in a forested area below. The Soviets would credit Dobrivichan with 3 MiG-15 night fighter kills during the Korean War. Operations and intelligence analysts deduced that the enemy's ability to concentrate its flak times and locations meant that they had somehow figured out the Shor-Ran arc. They had not, but the Russians exploited 343's crash site to recover Shor-Ran maps from the wreckage, and this intelligence trove offered Soviet targeteers a template from which to approximate strike data on direction and altitude from likely initial points to other targets now well known to the Soviets themselves. Here, a crew provides detailed data on the flak emplacements that they encountered to Intelligence Officer Second Lieutenant Robert D. Taft, Electronics Operator Airman First Class Everett Kilman Jr., Captain Everett F. Malone, pilot, and Aircraft Commander Captain James F. Milrick, who was wearing a locomotive engineer's cap after another successful strike on a rail span. Airman First Class Donald W. Oldenwerdle and First Lieutenant F.T. Pettibone give mission data to Intelligence Officer Captain Benny Shoup. But before the Soviets could use their discoveries to produce kill zones such as they had created back in April and October of 1951, BOMCOM had already changed tactics in light of the loss of 383. Within a week, the 307th would attack in yet another variation on its theme of rapid tactical innovation. For Mission 428 on 18-19 September, 11 B-29s struck a supply center with a bomber stream of smaller strike groups of 3 or 4 aircraft, each attacking from different directions in a dramatically shortened 1-minute interval, while following simultaneous use of 2 Shor-Ran arcs on multiple aim points. The bombers completed their bomb run in less than 6 minutes. The enemy offered no opposition to this mission. And the mission was conducted in daylight, the first daylight strike since October 1951. The airmen of the 307th had risen up the next day after a loss and pressed on with their mission. Tail gunner Tom Stevens' attitude was typical.
On the bomb run, there was a lot of flak. And on a bomb run, you can't take any evasive action. Your main concentration is on hitting the target. And as soon as the bombs were released, we'd make a steep decline or descent and turn, 180 turn, and trying to get out of the combat zone as quickly as we could. But the MiGs were not a problem. It was primarily flak because of the night missions being flown. We'd land and park the aircraft, and we'd be taken by truck to someplace and debriefed. And they would ask us what we saw, what we encountered, and they'd furnish us booze. I'm not so sure how accurate some of the information was after a few drinks of that whiskey that they gave us. As I recall, it was called Old Methuselah. I don't know if that's still on the market or not, or where they got that. But I do recall pouring some into a paper cup and picking up the cup and the bottom fell out. So it's pretty strong stuff. I can't think of anything else to tell you. I was a tail gunner.
Then the 307th suffered yet another disruption in command when Colonel Wynn was promoted to Brigadier General in September and rotated back to the Zone of the Interior after only 3 months as Wing Commander. Deputy Commander Colonel C.S. Overstreet stepped up to assume command temporarily. On October the 8th, the Communist delegation at Panmunjom rejected the United Nations' best and final offer on the issue of repatriation of prisoners of war. U.S. leaders were adamant that they would not accept any armistice that would require the U.S. to return North Korean and Chinese POWs who did not want to go back to communist rule. And the communists were equally adamant to demand the return of every one of their captured soldiers, whether they wanted to return or not. United Nations Command Chief Negotiator, U.S. Army General Harrison, declared an indefinite recess in the talks. With that statement, the entire UN delegation rose and left the meeting tent. In an attempt to apply military pressure to persuade the enemy to yield on its negotiating position, General Clark ordered a limited offensive designed to push their lines northward a few kilometers to take and occupy 2 of the 3 hill masses known as Triangle Hill. To support the ground troops fighting in the battle for Triangle Hill, Far Eastern Air Force's Commander General Wayland stepped up all B-29 close support to the 9th Corps from 1 strike per day to 3 strikes every 24 hours, day or night. And to keep pressure on the Communists during the truce talks recess, BOMCOM allocated 30% of its sorties to support of ground troops. When the smoke cleared at the end of November, despite UN forces taking and retaking the terrain more than once, the Chinese held on to the positions despite taking very heavy losses. U.S. forces suffered over 1,500 casualties. South Koreans lost nearly 4,700. The Chinese lost an estimated 19,000 troops, but U.S. and UN forces could not sustain such an exchange ratio. Chinese commanders convinced themselves that their attrition strategy would prevail. Back at Kadena Air Base, in October, the 307th finally began moving out of Tent City No. 2 and into newly completed permanent barracks. Collier's Magazine reporter Peter Kalischer ran a feature article splashed with color photos of easy living on Kadena. The new housing for airmen were 2-story concrete dormitories housing 165 men each, complete with hot and cold running water for showers, sinks, and toilets. Each building could house a mess hall and a day room. But a few months later, the decision to contract with the lowest bid Japanese builders proved unwise as paint began to peel, fixtures deteriorated, and the 307th had to crowd upwards of 250 men in each dorm. In November 1952, the 307th found its mark in the aerial destruction campaign as it completely destroyed 2 Chinese communication centers on the 1st and the 10th. On the 7th of November, 12 307th bombers encountered wing icing for the first time in the war, but pressed on to their mark and destroyed the Korean staff school at Yongpang-ni. One gunner claimed a MiG kill, but one aircraft did not return to base. There had been no flak over the target, but subsequent investigation disclosed that it had been shot down by a MiG-15 night fighter as the B-29 was on its bomb run. In a climactic mission on the 28th of November, all 3 medium bombardment wings conducted a maximum effort strike on the Yellow River airfields at Sinuiju and Wiju. The 307th once again drew Wiju Airfield as its target. Several B-29s dropped photo flash ordnance to illuminate the target area for quick turnaround bomb damage assessment. This post-strike photo mosaic from a similar mission in November 1951 shows the effect of such a mission. Over 40 bombs cratered the main concrete runway, rendering it unserviceable. A dozen or more MiG-15s burned on impact. Over 40 revetments indicate parking for a large formation of MiG-15s, and dozens of smaller revetments provided shelter for large batteries of anti-aircraft artillery. Communist searchlight operators managed to get 4 lock-ons for as long as 60 seconds, and 307th radar operators recorded 5 ineffective MiG-15 firing passes. 1 B-29 suffered only minor damage from flak. Soviet historians Leonid Krylov and Yuri Tepsurkayov provide us with a telling mission report that vindicated all the 307th's tactical innovations and personal sacrifices. Searching by shore-and beacons did not reap any rewards either, although there were instances when our fighter would get caught in the wake and enter a spin. These difficulties in locating the bombers meant that the Americans, for example, were able to bomb North Korean airfields at Wiju and Sinuiju, repeating the success of the raid they had made against this target in January of that year. Up to 32 B-29s bombed the airfields, anti-aircraft artillery positions close to the bridges, apartment blocks, and industrial assets in the cities of Wiju and Sinuiju. The photo bombs dropped by the enemy blinded the crews of the anti-aircraft batteries, which also made it more difficult to track targets and open fire. 36 B-29s passed through the searchlight zone, but not one of them was illuminated sufficiently to allow our fighters to detect and track them. The consequences of the raid on 28 November were dispiriting. The runway at Sinuiju Airfield sustained 81 direct hits, the runway at Wiju sustained 28 direct hits, and a further 28 bombs fell on the taxiways. It has to be said that the raid on 28 November was very successful for the Americans, and that North Korean air defenses, which were centered on the 64th Fighter Air Corps, suffered a significant defeat. 3 months after Colonel Wynn's departure, Colonel Austin J. Russell arrived at Kadena and assumed command of the 307th just before Christmas. Colonel Russell would remain in command with the 307th for the remainder of the Korean War. Despite the turnover in wing commanders, 4 in just 12 months, the 307th posted superior marks over its 18 missions in December. It topped BOMCOM statistics for the 3 B-29 wings in December with the highest in-commission rate at 72%, the greatest number of combat hours flown, 1,452, the highest number of training hours per crew, and with a composite bombing score of 449 feet circular error probable. In 1952, the 307th Bombardment Wing overcame enemy opposition, subdued Air Force-wide disciplinary problems, and met the challenges of training up 2 whole new cohorts of new crews to excel in the accomplishment of their combat missions. It did all this in part through tactical innovation, aircraft modifications, and enforcing high standards of maintenance and mission preparation. But that's only part of the story. The 307th transformed itself into a high-performance combat unit because every day, every airman arose, flew, and fought in the face of stiff enemy opposition, taking the risks inherent in going into battle in an aging aircraft. They gave no counsel to their fears and faithfully did their duty. Then they did it all over again the very next day.